It was the kind of morning that Maryland does better than almost anywhere else on the eastern seaboard, soft October light filtering through red and gold leaves, wood smoke drifting lazy from a neighbor's chimney, the air carrying that particular sharpness that arrives in autumn like an old acquaintance you both welcome and dread. Calvert County, 1992. A small community nestled between the Patuxent River on one side and the Chesapeake Bay on the other, a place where people knew each other's first names, where children still walked to school, where front doors were sometimes left unlocked until well past dark. A place where something like this was simply not supposed to happen. On the morning of October 14, 1992, a young woman named Sandra Marie Elliott, 31 years old, elementary school teacher, mother of 2 small children, wife of 8 years, did not arrive at Calvert Elementary School for her morning class. Her students waited. Her aide covered the room. By 9:15 in the morning, the principal had made 3 phone calls with no answer. By 10 o'clock, a colleague had driven to the Elliott residence on Solomon's Island Road and found the front door standing wide open, breakfast dishes still on the table, a half-drunk cup of coffee cooling on the counter, and Sandra's car parked in the driveway as though she had simply stepped outside for a moment and would be right back. She was never right back. And for 32 years, the question that hollowed out everyone who loved her, everyone who searched for her, everyone who lay awake in the years that followed wondering what they had missed, remained the same, unresolved and terrible. How does a woman simply vanish from her own home on an ordinary Wednesday morning? And where, in the name of everything good and decent, did she go? Calvert County in the early 1990s was the kind of Maryland that tourists rarely found and locals rarely left. Situated on a peninsula between 2 bodies of water, the county had a quiet, almost insular quality to it. Tobacco farming had been the economic backbone for generations, though by 1992 that backbone was beginning to bend under the pressure of a changing agricultural economy. New residential developments were spreading along the waterfront, bringing in young families from Washington, D.C. and Annapolis, people looking for space and community and a slower pace of life. The Elliott family was exactly that kind of transplant. Sandra Marie Elliott, born Sandra Marie Kovacs in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, had moved to Calvert County in 1986 with her husband, Robert James Elliott, 34 years old at the time of her disappearance, a regional sales manager for a building supply company based in Waldorf. They had purchased a modest colonial-style home on Solomon's Island Road, beige aluminum siding, black shutters, a long gravel driveway, a small backyard with a wooden swing set and a sandbox. The kind of house that announces its contentment without ever raising its voice. Sandra taught 3rd grade. Those who knew her described her as the teacher every child remembered, patient, warm, the kind of woman who kept a small jar of butterscotch candies on her desk and genuinely remembered the names of every parent she had ever met. She arrived at school by 7:45 each morning, parked her green 1989 Honda Accord in the faculty lot, and had coffee with her colleague Patricia Doan before the first bell. She left at 3:30, picked up her children, 8-year-old daughter Lily and 5-year-old son Marcus, from the school's aftercare program, and drove home to begin dinner. It was the kind of life that looked, from the outside, like a photograph of everything going right. The morning of October 14, 1992 began, by all accounts, as an ordinary Wednesday. Patricia Doan, Sandra's closest friend at Calvert Elementary, would later tell investigators that she and Sandra had spoken by telephone the evening before Tuesday, October 13th, around 7:30 in the evening. Sandra had been cheerful, she said. They had talked about a student whose reading scores had been improving and about a faculty meeting scheduled for Friday afternoon. Sandra had laughed at something Patricia said. Patricia could not remember what it was. She would spend years wishing she had written it down. Robert Elliott left the house that morning, according to his own account, at approximately 6:45 in the morning. He said Sandra was awake, making coffee, wearing a blue terracloth robe. He said she kissed him on the cheek. He said the children were still sleeping. He drove south toward Waldorf for a client meeting, a drive of approximately 45 minutes, and claimed to have arrived at the client's office, a building supply retailer in White Plains, at 7:30 in the morning. His client, a man named Gary Huffman, confirmed that Robert had been present for the meeting, which lasted until approximately 9 o'clock. By 9:45, when Sandra had not appeared at school and her colleague Patricia Doan drove to the house, here is what Patricia found. The front door open, the screen door unlatched and swaying slightly in the October wind. The kitchen table still set for a morning that had begun but not finished, 2 small bowls with dried cereal rings, a child's cartoon character cup, Sandra's coffee mug with a 1/4 inch of cold coffee still inside. The children's backpacks were sitting by the door, packed and ready. Lily and Marcus were upstairs in their rooms, dressed for school, frightened and alone. Lily, who was 8 years old and old enough to understand that something was wrong, told Patricia that their mommy had said she was going to check the mailbox and had not come back. The mailbox was at the end of the gravel driveway, approximately 120 feet from the front door. 120 feet. The mail had not been retrieved. There were no signs of a struggle inside the home. Sandra's purse was on the kitchen counter. Her car keys were hanging on the hook by the door. Her wallet, her identification, her credit cards, all present, all undisturbed. What was absent, investigators would note, was Sandra herself, and her brown winter coat that usually hung on the rack beside the children's jackets. It was as though she had stepped outside into an ordinary October morning, and the morning had simply swallowed her whole. The swing set stood still in the backyard. The red toy truck Marcus had left in the sandbox the night before lay on its side. The gravel driveway showed no tire marks that investigators would find meaningful in those first hours. Calvert County Sheriff's Department deputies arrived by 11:30 that morning, and by noon the driveway had already been walked by Patricia Doan, 2 neighbors who had come to take the children, and 3 responding officers. Whatever the gravel might have told them was already compromised by the time anyone thought to look. Robert Elliott was reached by telephone at his client's office in White Plains at 10:15 in the morning. By 11, he was driving back to Solomon's Island Road. Deputies who met him in the driveway that afternoon noted that he arrived at 11:48, his face arranged in an expression of concern, his voice measured and cooperative. He answered every question they asked. He shook hands firmly. He did not cry. Not once in those first hours did he cry. Part 2. The investigation, search, and growing suspicions. The official search for Sandra Marie Elliott began the afternoon of October 14, 1992, and expanded rapidly through the following days into one of the largest coordinated efforts Calvert County had mounted in recent memory. The Calvert County Sheriff's Department, working in conjunction with the Maryland State Police, organized ground search teams that swept the wooded areas along Solomon's Island Road within 48 hours of the disappearance. Volunteers, neighbors, church members, colleagues from the school, strangers who had seen the news gathered in the parking lot of St. John's Catholic Church on Route 4 and fanned out in organized lines, moving through underbrush and drainage ditches, and the stands of pine and oak that back up against the residential properties in that part of the county. Dive teams searched a retention pond half a mile from the Elliott house. Search dogs from the Maryland State Police K-9 unit were brought in on October 16th and worked the area for 3 days. They found nothing. The Patuxent River Search and Rescue Unit ran boats along the shoreline. Calvert County Emergency Services coordinated aerial reconnaissance on October 18th and 19th. The Chesapeake Bay Foundation, whose personnel knew those waters better than anyone, assisted with waterborne search efforts along the western shore. Patricia Doane organized a community flyer campaign that placed Sandra's photograph, dark brown hair, hazel eyes, a wide, open smile in every business window in Prince Frederick, Lusby, and Solomons. The community response was, by every account, extraordinary. People drove from as far as Anne Arundel County to volunteer. Local restaurants sent food to the search coordination point. A woman named Dolores Finch, who had never met Sandra, drove 40 miles round trip every day for a week to help sort through tip line calls at the sheriff's station. This was the kind of community Calvert County wanted to be, and in many ways still was. Clear's throat. But even as the public search expanded, the investigative focus was quietly, methodically narrowing. Those who knew him said Robert Elliott had always been a contained man, not cold exactly, but controlled, the kind of person who never quite let you see around the corners of his expressions. In the days following Sandra's disappearance, this quality became something investigators found themselves returning to again and again. He was cooperative, unfailingly so. He answered every question. He submitted to interviews without resistance. He made appearances at community search events, standing beside Patricia Doane and other colleagues, wearing a look of grave, measured concern. But there was no crying. Deputies whispered quietly among themselves about this. It was not evidence, strictly speaking. People expressed shock and grief in profoundly different ways, and seasoned investigators know better than to draw conclusions from composure alone. And yet there was something about the specific quality of Robert Elliott's stillness, something studied about it, something that felt assembled rather than genuine, that registered with the investigators who spent the most time with him. Lead investigator, Sergeant David Mallory of the Maryland State Police, wrote in his case notes on October 19, 1992, 5 days after Sandra's disappearance. Subject remains cooperative, demeanor controlled, have not observed spontaneous emotional response despite repeated contact. Requests for additional interviews met with attorney referral beginning October 18th. The attorney referral, that detail. Robert Elliott had called a defense attorney by the morning of October 18th, 4 days after his wife disappeared. His explanation was entirely reasonable. He had watched enough news to know that spouses were always scrutinized, he said, and he simply wanted to protect himself from unfair suspicion. Many innocent people make exactly this calculation. But the timeline that investigators began constructing told a different kind of story. Robert said he had left the house at 6:45 in the morning. His client, Gary Huffman, confirmed a 7:30 arrival in White Plains. Sergeant Mallory drove that route himself on October 21st, departing Solomon's Island Road at 6:45 in the morning under typical weekday traffic conditions. His arrival time in White Plains, 7:29. Not impossible. Barely possible, actually. The route required averaging speeds that were technically legal but left no margin for error, no stop for gas, no coffee, nothing. It was a drive that required a driver who knew exactly where they were going and never slowed down. Robert's vehicle, a 1991 Chevrolet Silverado pickup truck, was examined with consent on October 22nd. The odometer reading, compared against Robert's account of his recent driving activity, showed an excess of approximately 31 miles that Robert could not immediately account for. He later suggested a detour he had taken the previous week to visit a job site, a detail that could be neither confirmed nor eliminated. The interior of the truck was clean, remarkably clean, investigators noted, for a vehicle belonging to a sales representative who regularly transported product samples and drove to construction sites. The floor mats appeared freshly washed. There was a faint chemical smell in the cab that Robert explained as a cleaning product he had used after spilling coffee the previous Sunday. The forensic laboratory found no biological evidence in the vehicle. The cleaning, whatever it had achieved, had been thorough. Tip line calls continued through October and into November, generating leads that were followed and resolved and followed again. A woman in Lusby reported seeing a woman matching Sandra's description at a gas station on Route 4 on the morning of October 14th. But the timeline placed this sighting at approximately the same hour Sandra was already not at school, and the description, on closer examination, was too vague to be certain. A former student of Sandra's, now in middle school, called to say he had seen a dark truck parked on Solomon's Island Road early that morning, but his description of the truck matched dozens of vehicles registered in the county. By December of 1992, the active daily search had wound down. Sergeant Mallory's case file was nearly 4 inches thick. He had no body, no forensic evidence linking Robert to his wife's disappearance, no witness who could place Robert anywhere that conflicted with his stated timeline, and no viable alternative suspect. Sandra Elliott had a good marriage, or appeared to. She had no documented conflicts with anyone. She had no history of leaving, no indication she had planned to go anywhere, no secret life that anyone could locate. The case did not close. It was never officially closed. But by the spring of 1993, it had done what investigators dread most. It had gone quiet. Sandra's photograph remained on the bulletin board at the Calvert County Sheriff's Station for years. Sergeant Mallory kept a copy in his desk. He retired in 2007, having never stopped thinking about a Wednesday morning in October, a gravel driveway 120 feet long, and a cup of coffee that had gone cold on a kitchen counter. Part 3. The Silence, Years Passing, Life After. Time does something strange to a case without resolution. It does not soften the questions, it deepens them, lays sediment over them, makes them harder to excavate but no less present, no less sharp when they finally surface. By the summer of 1993, Robert Elliott had enrolled Lily and Marcus in a different school district and had begun, quietly, to rebuild the architecture of a life. He hired a housekeeper to help with the children's care. He continued working at the building supply company. He attended parent-teacher conferences alone, answered questions about his wife with a brief, practiced phrase, "She's still missing," "We're still hopping," and otherwise maintained the surface of normalcy with what neighbors described as almost admirable steadiness. Almost. For those who have ever doubted someone they love, carried a suspicion they could neither prove nor release, a feeling that settled into the chest like something swallowed wrong. The people who remained close to the Elliott family during those years would recognize that particular weight. Patricia Doan, who had loved Sandra the way you love the friend who understands you without effort, found herself watching Robert at community events with an attention she could not explain and could not stop. She told her husband once in 1994 that she felt like she was watching a performance. Her husband told her grief made people strange. She accepted that explanation. She did not believe it. Lily Elliott, who had been 8 years old on the morning her mother went to check the mailbox and never came back, began having nightmares that her teachers reported to school counselors by early 1993. In her second-grade classroom at her new school, She drew pictures with a consistency that her counselor documented. A house, a driveway, a small figure at the end of the driveway, and in many of the drawings, a large dark shape nearby. When the counselor asked Lily about the dark shape, Lily said it was a shadow. When the counselor asked whose shadow, Lily said she did not know. She was 8 years old. She was doing what children do, translating what she felt into the only language available to her. Marcus was 5 when his mother disappeared and would turn 6 that December. He was too young to carry a coherent narrative of that morning, but he was not too young to carry its emotional residue. His kindergarten teacher at the new school noted in her end-of-year report that Marcus was an unusually watchful child, observant in a way that felt less like curiosity and more like vigilance, as though he was always waiting for something to change without warning. Clear's throat. The marriage, if it could still be called that, the state of a household whose linchpin had vanished, did not have to deteriorate because it could not deteriorate. Sandra was gone. What remained was a household, a man, and 2 children learning to occupy a shape that had been made for someone else entirely. Robert Elliott began dating by late 1994. The woman, a coworker named Angela Torres, divorced, 2 children of her own, moved into the house on Solomon's Island Road in the summer of 1995. The response from the community was what you might expect from a small county where everyone had spent 3 years watching Robert play the role of grieving husband, quiet, discomfited, and various. Some people said it was healthy, that the children needed stability, that life had to continue. Others said it was too soon, too comfortable, too easy for a man whose wife had never been found. Patricia Doan stopped attending community events where Robert might be present. She and Sandra's mother, Irene Kovacs, who had driven from Pittsburgh in October 1992 and returned every year on the anniversary of Sandra's disappearance, maintained a careful, sustained correspondence throughout the late 90s. They shared what they knew. They shared what they suspected. They had no evidence. They had no power. They had only the particular perseverance of women who refused to let a name become a footnote. In 1997, Irene Kovacs contacted the Maryland State Police's Cold Case Unit, newly reorganized under a different administrative structure that had begun to bring fresh personnel to long-stalled investigations. The responding investigator, a younger detective named Carla Ingham, reviewed the original case file and requested a follow-up interview with Robert Elliott, who had by that point married Angela Torres in a small ceremony that Lily and Marcus attended in the backyard of the house on Solomon's Island Road. Robert declined the interview. His attorney, the same attorney he had retained in October 1992, declined on his behalf, citing what he described as an absence of new evidence and a pattern of ongoing harassment of his client. Detective Ingham made a note in the file. She flagged 3 items she found worth returning to: the odometer discrepancy, the cleaned floor mats, and a detail she had found in a footnote of the original investigation that had never been fully pursued. A neighbor's observation, recorded in an interview from October 22, 1992, that he had heard what he described as a brief, sharp sound on the morning of October 14th, at approximately 6:55 in the morning, that he had initially attributed to a car backfiring. He lived 2 houses north of the Elliott property. He had been walking his dog in his backyard when he heard it. 6:55 in the morning. If Robert Elliott had left the house at 6:45 as he claimed, then 6:55 placed him still within minutes of the house. Or, if his departure had been earlier or later than stated, potentially still present. The neighbor, a retired postal worker named Howard Greer, was re-interviewed by Detective Ingham in 1997 and confirmed his original statement. He said he had always wondered about it. He said nobody had ever called him back after the first interview in 1992. Detective Ingham wrote in her updated case notes, "Greer's account potentially significant. Sound description and timeline warrant further examination in light of ballistic analysis that was not completed in original investigation." The note was filed. The case continued to sit. Years passed with the steady, unremarkable accumulation of ordinary time. Lily Elliott turned 18, graduated high school, left Maryland for a university in North Carolina. Marcus turned 16, 17. He was a quiet teenager, his teachers said, not troubled exactly, but guarded. He had the eyes of someone older than his years, someone who had learned early that the world could contain surprises it did not announce. Robert and Angela had a daughter together in 1998. The house on Solomon's Island Road, where Sandra had made coffee and packed lunch boxes and graded papers at the kitchen table, now held a different family wearing the same address. Sandra's case was reviewed again, briefly, in 2004 when Calvert County formed a dedicated cold case review team. Nothing actionable emerged. The file returned to storage. And then it was 2024, 32 years after a Wednesday morning in October, 32 years since a cup of coffee went cold on a kitchen counter. Part 4, The Revelation Truth Emerges. The call came on March 3, 2024, at 11:17 in the morning, to the tip line maintained by the Maryland State Police's Unsolved Cases Unit. The caller did not give a name immediately. She said she needed to speak to someone who was working on the Sandra Elliott case. She said she had information that had been kept for a very long time. She said she was calling because she could not, in good conscience, keep it any longer. The caller was Lily Elliott. She was 40 years old. Clears throat. Investigators with the Maryland State Police Unsolved Cases Unit, now operating under a restructured division that had been formally incorporated into a statewide cold case initiative in 2021, received Lily's call and within 48 hours had arranged a formal recorded interview at their offices in Pikesville, Maryland. Lead detective for the renewed investigation was Sergeant First Class Renee Acaffer, whose unit had reopened 23 cold cases in the preceding 3 years and cleared 6 of them. Lily Elliott sat across from Sergeant Acaffer in a small interview room on March 5, 2024. She was, by every description from those present, composed but not cold, the composure of someone who had spent a long time getting to a conversation and was determined to finish it now that they had arrived. She told Sergeant Acaffer something she had never told anyone in an official capacity before. When Lily was a child, when she was 8 years old, living in that house on Solomon's Island Road, she had seen her father's truck in the driveway at a time when he was supposed to already have left for work. She had gotten up earlier than usual that morning, she explained, because she was excited about a school project. She had come to the top of the stairs. The front door, she said, was open, or partially open. She could see through the storm door to the driveway. Her father's truck was still there. She thought nothing of it at the time. She was 8. She went back upstairs and played with her toys until her mother came to help her get dressed, and then, after a time that she could not precisely measure as a child, her mother had not come. She had assumed for years that she had misread the scene, that it had been a neighbor's truck, that the light had been strange and she had been mistaken. She had told herself this story carefully, and for a long time, because the alternative, the thing her memory was insisting on, the thing that lived underneath the drawing of the dark shadow at the end of the driveway, was not a thing she could have held at 8 years old. but she was 40 now, and her brother Marcus, who had turned 37 that December, had called her 6 months earlier, September of 2023, and told her something of his own. Marcus, who had been 5 years old in October 1992 and had been considered too young by the original investigators to be a reliable witness to anything, had his own memory. He had always had it, not a clear, sequential narrative, but an impression, the kind of childhood memory that feels less like a scene and more like a sensation. He remembered a sound, very early in the morning, from somewhere outside. He remembered his father coming to check on him in his room. He remembered the smell of his father's coat, an outdoors smell, a cold air smell, and his father's hands when he touched his forehead, the hands being cold and being strange, and the strange thing being not the cold itself, but the way his father had looked at him, which Marcus could only describe, in the language of a 37-year-old man reconstructing a 32-year-old morning, as the look of someone making sure of something. Together, Lily and Marcus had called a family attorney. Together, they had been guided through the process of making formal statements. Together, they had done what it had taken them 3 decades to find the strength to do. The reopened investigation moved quickly. Sergeant Acker's unit, working with the Maryland Office of the Attorney General's Criminal Investigations Division and the Calvert County State's Attorney's Office, began assembling a case that drew on 32 years of available technology that had not existed in 1992. The original evidence materials, though limited, had been preserved in state storage according to Maryland protocol. The chemical analysis originally applied to Robert's truck in October 1992 had been inconclusive. Resubmission to a modern forensic laboratory, using updated mass spectrometry techniques, revealed trace biological material embedded in the seam between the truck bed's floor panel and its wall material that 1992 technology had not been sensitive enough to detect, and that had survived the intervening decades in a degraded but analyzable state. The biological material, a fragment of cellular matter consistent with human tissue, was submitted for DNA analysis in April of 2024. The analysis required 11 weeks. In June of 2024, the results confirmed a match to Sandra Marie Elliott's maternal line, established through mitochondrial DNA comparison with Irene Kovacs, Sandra's mother, who was 83 years old and had driven from Pittsburgh to provide her sample with the steadiness of a woman who had been waiting 32 years to be necessary in this exact way. Clear's throat. Howard Greer, the retired postal worker who had described hearing a sharp, brief sound at 6:55 on the morning of October 14, 1992, had passed away in 2009. But his original statement existed in the case file. His 1997 re-interview with Detective Ingham existed in the case file. And his account, corroborated now by Lily's recollection of the truck still in the driveway, by Marcus's memory of his father's cold hands, by the DNA trace in the truck bed, formed a pillar in a structure that the Calvert County State's Attorney's Office determined, by August of 2024, was sufficient to support charges. The warrant for Robert James Elliott's arrest was issued on August 22, 2024. He was 66 years old. He and Angela had divorced in 2019. He was living alone in a townhouse in Waldorf, Maryland, the same city where he had claimed to have driven that October morning, the city whose direction he had used as his alibi, the city that was 45 minutes from a driveway 120 feet long. Waldorf Police Department officers and Maryland State Police executed the arrest warrant at 6:50 in the morning on August 23, 2024. The specific timing was not coincidental. Sergeant Acker, when asked about it later, said only that details matter. Robert Elliott answered the door of his townhouse in Waldorf at 6:50 in the morning and found officers who had come for him 32 years after he had stood in a driveway in Calvert County, composed and cooperative, shaking hands with deputies as though he were meeting them at a sales conference rather than the ruins of his wife's life. He said nothing when the handcuffs were applied. According to the arresting officer's report, his face showed no emotion that could be named. He was walked to the patrol vehicle in a gray t-shirt and dark sweatpants, his white hair uncombed, his hands secured behind him, and he did not look back at the townhouse when they placed him in the car. The community of Calvert County learned about the arrest through local news alerts before 9 that morning. The Calvert Recorder, the Southern Maryland News, and Baltimore's major television affiliates had the story by 9:30. By noon, it had been picked up by national outlets. The reactions were, as they almost always are, various and loud and intensely human. There were many people, particularly those who had known Sandra or had participated in the 1992 search, for whom the arrest was not a shock at all. Patricia Doan, who was 67 years old and retired and still lived in Calvert County, was reached by telephone by a reporter from the Baltimore Sun at 10:30 in the morning on August 23rd. She did not express surprise. She said, simply, "I have been waiting for this day for 32 years." She said Sandra deserved to be remembered as more than a cold case statistic. She said she hoped the children, she still called Lily and Marcus the children, despite their being 40 and 37, could finally breathe. There were others, fewer in number but equally vocal, who expressed disbelief. Former colleagues of Roberts, people who had worked alongside him through the 90s and maintained contact over the years, spoke to media outlets with a confusion that sounded, in several cases, like genuine shock. One man who had attended Robert and Angela's wedding in 1997 told a local television reporter, "I just can't reconcile this. The man I knew raised those kids. He went to their graduations. This doesn't add up to me." This is the part that documentary narratives often elide but shouldn't. The fact that the capacity for real harm and the capacity for ordinary human warmth are not mutually exclusive. People who commit terrible acts do not announce themselves with visible signifiers. They coach Little League and attend graduations and make coffee and shake hands and seem, to almost everyone who knows them, like the version of themselves they have constructed with great care and sustained effort. Robert James Elliott was charged with first-degree unlawful taking of life in the disappearance and presumed death of Sandra Marie Elliott, because Sandra's remains had never been located and had still not been located as of the date of his arrest. The prosecution faced the particular challenge of building a case around absence as much as evidence. Maryland law permits prosecution in such cases where sufficient circumstantial evidence, combined with forensic findings and credible witness testimony, establishes guilt beyond reasonable doubt. The Calvert County State's Attorney, in a press conference held August 23, 2024, outlined the components of the case. The DNA trace material recovered from Robert's truck, the testimony of both Lily and Marcus Elliott, the 1992 statement of Howard Greer and its preservation in the case record, the odometer discrepancy documented by Sergeant Mallory in 1992, the timeline analysis that had established the difficulty of his claimed departure time, and new to the 2024 investigation, cell tower records, obtained through an expanded digital warrant. That placed Robert's mobile telephone, registered in 1992 to his employer, in the vicinity of the Solomons Island Road address until approximately 7:12 in the morning on October 14, 1992, not 6:45, as he had always maintained. 7:12. 27 minutes, that had been hiding in a cell carrier's records for 32 years. 27 minutes that placed Robert Elliott at his own home well after the time when, by his account, he had already kissed his wife's cheek and driven away. Robert Elliott entered a not guilty plea at his arraignment on September 9, 2024, in the Calvert County Circuit Court. His defense attorney, newly retained, the original attorney having passed away in 2016, argued that the DNA evidence was degraded and insufficient, that the testimony of Lily and Marcus constituted unreliable recovered childhood memory rather than direct witness account, and that the cell tower data was ambiguous given the coverage zones applicable to 1992 technology. The court date for trial was set for March 2025. Irene Kovacs, Sandra's mother, attended the arraignment. She was 83 years old and had driven from Pittsburgh with her surviving daughter, Sandra's younger sister Anna. She sat in the third row of the gallery with her hands folded in her lap, and she watched Robert Elliott stand before the court with his attorney, and she listened to him say not guilty in a voice that was still, even now, remarkably controlled. When a reporter asked her afterward how she felt, she said, "I feel like my daughter has been waiting a long time, and so have I." She did not say anything else. She walked to her car in the September sunshine with her younger daughter at her side, and she drove back toward the highway, back toward Pittsburgh, carrying what she had always carried, the weight of a name and a face and a Wednesday morning, and a cup of coffee that had gone cold. Closing. Music returns, the same slow strings from the opening, slightly fuller now, a low cello underneath. Sandra Marie Elliott would have been 63 years old in 2024. She would have watched her daughter turn 40 and her son turn 37. She would have met grandchildren, perhaps, or not, but she would have had the choice. She would have had the ordinary, incalculable gift of time, of deciding for herself what to do with an autumn morning, of going to the mailbox and coming back inside and finishing her coffee while it was still warm. What this case reveals, and what it shares with so many cases like it, cases that stretch across years in silence, and the particular fatigue of loving someone the justice system cannot seem to find, is that truth is not always swift, but it is frequently stubborn. It lives in the statements of children who did not know what they were seeing. It lives in the meticulous notes of a sergeant who kept a photograph in his desk long after everyone else had moved on. It lives in the cellular data of a network that recorded, without judgment, where a telephone was at 7:12 in the morning on October 14, 1992. It lives in the patience of a woman who drove from Pittsburgh every October to hold the name of her daughter in a place that had mostly stopped saying it. The case of Sandra Marie Elliott reminds us that the people we lose to the worst impulses of those who were supposed to protect them deserve more than a file in a cabinet. They deserve the accumulation of every effort, however long it takes, however many years of quiet persistence it requires. They deserve for someone to keep looking, keep asking, keep refusing the comfortable explanation that nothing can be done. The swing hung still, the toy truck lay on its side, and a daughter 32 years later picked up the telephone. Sandra, wherever you have been, you were not forgotten, not for a single day.